What is going on, Chess YouTube? So in today's video, I have yet another incredible game featuring everyone's favorite Indian superstar Gukesh D. This one is Gukesh versus the GOAT Magnus Carlsen from the 2023 Zagreb SuperUnited Blitz Tournament. And here we go. In the game, Gukesh is playing as white. He opens 1e4, best by test, and Magnus does go 1c5, the Sicilian defense. From here, we have knight f3 and e6 for Magnus. Now d4, c takes, knight takes. And which variation of the Sicilian defense is Magnus going to go for? Well, today it is the Taimanov variation with the move knight to c6. Now from here, both sides follow the main line for several moves. We have knight c3, queen c7, the typical square for the queen in the Taimanov. Then bishop e3, the most aggressive move, potentially starting the famous English attack with the moves queen d2 and long castles. Now here, Magnus, again, he plays the typical Taimanov move a6, controlling b5 and setting up the b5 advance in the near future. And now Gukesh goes for perhaps the strongest and most aggressive line against the Taimanov, at least according to modern computer engines, and that is the pawn sacrifice move g4. Gaining space on the king's side, he's going for an English attack with the move g4 before going f3 or queen d2, and in the Taimanov, this move does work out quite well. Now from here, the main line starts with the move b5 for black. Real fast, I want to show you where this leads. It does lead to a pawn sacrifice. The critical point in that line is right here in this position. As you can see, white gives up that pawn on e4 to the queen, but in return, he has very dangerous compensation in the form of the attack against the black king and even the queen, as it is quite vulnerable. Now, heading back to the game, in this position, Magnus does not go for the main line starting with the move b5. Instead, he does play the move h6, potentially stopping an immediate g5 advance from white. Now here, Gukesh, the two most aggressive moves are h4 and rook to g1 in the spirit of the Carrez attack against the Scheveningen Sicilian. And here he does play h4, very aggressive. And now, very interestingly, Magnus, he does play the strongest move here. That is the move b5. And sure enough, we do head down that main line of this fast g4 line of the Taimanov. It's just with the extra moves h6 and h4 inserted. All right, here we go. In the game here, Gukesh, the strongest move is knight takes c6. That is what he plays. Instead, if you go rook g1, then black can go b4, followed by bishop b7 with an excellent game. So here, knight takes c6. Now, very importantly, Magnus must recapture with the right piece. If you go d takes c6, that is a massive mistake. Then white can simply go queen to f3, and he has tremendous pressure on this long diagonal in a very good game. Now, instead, here, queen takes c6 is the move for Magnus. And now Gukesh, if he wants to defend that pawn on e4, he can just go f3, again, in the spirit of the English attack, and he will have a perfectly fine game and very good chances for an advantage. But instead, Gukesh plays the most aggressive move here. That is queen d2, going for the pawn sacrifice line, again with the moves h6 and h4 inserted. And Magnus here, he's going for the fight. He goes for it. b4, driving back the knight and removing the defender of that pawn on e4. Now we have knight to e2, queen takes e4, winning the pawn. And now here's the idea for white. You just slide the rook over, rook g1, very sly. The point being the rook is now defended, it's not being attacked. And you can follow up bishop g2. Now, that is a very real threat in this position. Bishop g2 immediately would skewer the queen and the rook. Therefore, here, Magnus must respond immediately, somehow, some way, likely involving moving that queen off that vulnerable e4 square. Now, in this position, what are black's options? Well, it turns out he has many playable moves. For example, rook b8 is one option, getting out of the way of the future bishop g2 skewer, but typically the queen must move. Now, the best squares for the queen include c4, c6, and b7. The point being, if you go c6 or b7, you can follow up d5 in the near future, trying to close down that long diagonal. And again, white is going to be down a pawn no matter what, but again, his attack will be very vicious. All right, now, queen c4 is the move chosen by Magnus in the game, perhaps the most combative. Now, the idea is you do prevent long castles, as if white does long castle here. He loses that pawn on a2 on the spot. The queen just gobbles it up. So instead here, Gukesh has to find a way to put some pressure on that queen. Now, of course, the queen is quite vulnerable on c4. For example, the knight can go to, say, d4, f4, or even g3, and all of these do open up the discovered attack of the bishop on the queen, and that is what happens. In the game, Gukesh does go knight to f4, a perfectly good move, again, opening up the attack on the queen. Now, where is the queen going to go? Your options are d5, c6, and c7. In the game, Magnus finds the best move, as usual, queen c7, sliding the queen all the way back to the typical Taimanov square for the queen on c7. Now here, Gukesh, with that pawn on a2 no longer being attacked, he can castle queenside, and that is what he does here. So, long castles is the move. Then we have knight to f6, and here, Gukesh, he's got to find the right way to proceed. Now, shockingly, this one really surprised me personally. I don't know about you, but here the computer Stockfish loves the move knight to h5, putting pressure on that knight, threatening the trade, and if black takes on h5, after g takes, despite having those weak double pawns on the h file, the rook is open up on the g file. It is pressure on g7, and overall, white's attack more than compensates for the missing pawn and the weakened pawn structure. Now, instead of knight h5 in this blitz game, here, Gukesh does go g5. It looks very logical. After all, g4, h4, and rook g1 were all played with the idea of going g5, pressuring that knight. But it turns out it does not work here at all. Here, Magnus, h takes, then knight e4, jumping in with the knight and pressuring the vulnerable queen on d2. Where is the queen going to go? It goes to d4, but Magnus, he does not mind. He just goes bishop b7, bolstering the knight on e4 that was being attacked by the queen. And very importantly, Magnus, he's just going to go rook c8, threatening checkmate on c2, and after that, all of his pieces will be perfectly placed virtually. I mean, the bishop on b7, perfect, the queen on c7, and rook on c8, threatening checkmate coming up. The rook on h8, despite black not castling, that rook is super active on the h-file. It can go to h2 or h4 in the future. So Magnus, it's amazing how he always just gets these perfect positions where all of his pieces are just immaculate. All right, bishop g2, putting pressure on the long diagonal. But now Magnus, knight d6, jumping back with the knight and offering the bishop trade. Will Gukesh go for it? Turns out, no, he will not. He takes back that missing pawn. Queen takes b4. Now the material is even. But here, Magnus, rook c8, threatening checkmate on c2. The audacity of this man. All right, queen to a4, defends the c2 pawn. But now we have bishop takes g2, trading bishops. Now, very importantly, Gukesh, he has to find the right recapture. If you like puzzles, pause the video and try to sort out, do you want to recapture with the rook or the knight? It is very important to find the right recapture. That is my one hint for you, my friend. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this. All right, here in this position, the right recapture, believe it or not, is not taking with the rook. That is the more obvious one, but jumping back with the knight, it turns out, is the stronger move. The point being the knight can go to, say, e1 or d3, getting back into the game. And beyond that, the computer also loves the idea of after knight takes going bishop d4, putting pressure on the long diagonal with the bishop, preventing the bishop on f8 from developing, and then going knight to e3. And it turns out e3 is an excellent square for the knight, and the rook is better placed on the back rank where it can defend. So overall, knight takes g2 is the move, but instead in the game, rook takes g2 played by Gukesh. That is the more obvious move at first glance, but it turns out to be quite a bit weaker, as you can see by the eval bar just collapsing on the left. All right, now here Magnus, he's got many different choices to proceed with the attack. Potentially the strongest move here, and the cheekiest, or the cheesiest, whatever you want to call it, is rook to h4, pinning the knight on f4 to the queen on a4, and therefore threatening the move e5, technically, trying to win that piece. And beyond that, I mean, the rook is just tremendously active on h4. It's almost impossible to get rid of it. I mean, the knight and the the knight and the bishop are in no position to attack the h4 square anytime soon. All right, now, instead of that here, Magnus, he just goes for an endgame. Magnus being the greatest endgame player of all time, he just goes queen to c6, offering the queen trade. Now, here, queen takes and rook takes is what happens, and now knight d3, trying to centralize the knight. And now, in the endgame, technically material is even. Remember, Gukesh lost that pawn on e4 earlier in the game out of the opening, but he did regain that pawn on b4 with the queen. Therefore, material is 100% even. But overall here, Magnus, the computer says he has a small edge thanks to his slightly more active rooks and pieces in general. All right, now from here, knight f5, pressuring that vulnerable bishop on e3. Now we have knight to e5, jumping in with the knight. Then rook c7 moves back the rook, bishop f4. Now we have many different discovered attacks. For example, knight g6 is being threatened with the double attack on the rook on h8 and the rook on c7. That would be devastating. Now here, Magnus, he sees that, of course, his move is rook to h4, finally bringing his rook into the game on the 4th rank. Now here, Gukesh, he doesn't mind. He just goes knight g6 anyway. A brilliant move. The point being, now both rooks again are being attacked. This is a very comical tactical position here. So here, Magnus, rook c4 is the move. Now Gukesh, obviously, he has the option of knight takes h4. However, that may not be the best idea, as then after knight takes h4 back, then both the bishop on f4 and the rook on g2 are being attacked by either the knight or the rook. That would be a tactical disaster. So with that in mind here, Gukesh, he just simply goes knight takes f8, trading that knight for the bishop. Then we have king takes, and then just bishop e5, getting his bishop out of the attack. And now Gukesh, he does have that bishop versus the knight in the endgame, but unfortunately Magnus, his pieces are just so tremendously active here. He just goes king to e7, defending that hanging pawn on d7, and now look at this. He's ready to go d5 if he needs it, and again, his rooks are just so active in the endgame. All right, b3 hits the rook, rook c to e4, centralizes the rook, then we have bishop c3 sliding back, and then d5. Now a4, gaining space on the queen side, rook to h3, pressures that bishop, king b2 defends the bishop, and now here, Magnus, the strongest move is just d4, driving back that bishop once again, and driving down his central pawn majority. Instead, rook to f3 is the move, putting pressure on that weak pawn on f2. Now, rook d2 defends, rook h3, Magnus sharking around, rook g1, and then finally d4, sure enough, is the move. Now here, Gukesh, bishop b4 hits the king d7, c3, and then e5. Again, Magnus, he has that central pawn majority, those pawns on d4 and e5. In the endgame, your main priority is to find your pawn majority and push them down the board, and Magnus, he knows that. He's a very stable chess genius. All right, c takes d4, then knight takes, then bishop c3, hits the knight on d4, then we have king to e6, marching down the board with the king. Now, here, in this position, Gukesh, he plays a move that really surprised me. He did give up his bishop on c3 for the knight, so bishop takes d4. Again, you typically don't want to do that in an open-ish position like this. The bishop's typically a little bit better with pawns on both sides of the board in the endgame in a relatively open position, but instead, bishop takes d4 was played. Now, rook takes d4, rook takes, and e takes, and now we do have a rook endgame. We have the rook, the king, and the pawns for both sides, and someone once said all rook endgames are drawn. I believe that was Lasker, Emmanuel Lasker. If I'm wrong, let me know in the comment section below. There was some famous chess player from the early 1900s, late 1800s who said all rook endgames are drawn. And while that may be true some of the time, there is a lot of life left in this position. And of course, Magnus being the GOAT of endgames, he's going to play on till the bitter end. He wants to win at all costs. All right, rook c1, getting the rook on the open c file. Now king d5, rook c7, hitting that pawn on f7. Now we have rook to f3, then king c1, and rook takes f2. Now b4, gaining space on the queen side, d3, and now here, Gukesh, he's got to find one of two moves. The best one is g6, trying to weaken that pawn on a7. If g takes f7, if f takes g7, then rook takes g7, wins that pawn, and he will have a lot of pressure on the king side. Now, also f6, then simply rook takes, wins the pawn. Instead of that move, though, he goes b5, and this turns out to be a critical blunder. Here, Magnus, he just takes on b5, and now here, no matter what you do, even if you go g6, then b takes a4, wins that a4 pawn, and Magnus is just too far advanced with that pawn race on the queen side. Instead, here, Gukesh does take back on b5, a takes b5 is the move. Then we have rook to c2, offering that rook trade. Now, rook takes, d takes, king takes, and then king c5 hits that pawn on the b5 square. All right, now, king d3, king takes b5, and here, Magnus, he has a king and pawn endgame where he is up a pawn. All he really has to do here is march his king back, defend that pawn on f7, not let the white king get too far advanced, and he will be effectively winning. Let's see if he can pull it off. King d4, then king c6, king e5, king d7, king d5, king e7, king e5, and now Magnus. The very simple move, he just plays g6. That is the right idea. Instead, if you go f6 here, then after g takes, then perhaps king to f5, it would actually be a drawn endgame, as after, say, king f7, king f4, white would have the opposition. If you don't know that, look up, basic king and pawn endgames. I can't explain it all here, but that would be a drawn endgame. You know what? I'm going to show it real fast. For example, if f6, then g takes, king to f5, king f7, then king f4, and here if black ever marches the king down, say, king to e5, then king e4, for example, push the pawn, the king's move, and you just keep doing it over and over, and black eventually gets a stalemate. I'll just show you it real fast here. Just, continuing to play these moves. This is basically what happened. And eventually, if you want to defend the pawn, we do get a stalemate. So way back here, instead of f6, g6 was played, and now black is going to win the opposition. For example, if you go back, say, king to f4, then king d6 would move. If you go king e4, then king e6 wins the opposition. And finally, if you go, say, king to d4, then you can just go king d6, and again, sooner or later, you're going to win. Now here, Gukesh does go king to e4, and in this position, he just resigns on the spot to Magnus. And here, real fast, I'll show you why. Let's say the king goes to, I don't know, king to f4. Then the move here, first Magnus would go king e6, gaining the opposition. Let's say white goes king to, well, let's first go king d4, then simply king to f5 would win that pawn. Instead, if you go king f4, then the move is king to d5, again, trying to fight for the opposition. Again, where's the king supposed to go? If you go back, move the king over. If you go back here, then again, there basically wins. And finally, if you go king to g4, then the move king to e4, again, fights for the opposition. Sooner or later, that pawn will be lost. For example, if you move the king back, you march the king in, the king has to go back, then you win it. And obviously, anyone can win that endgame. So wow, what a game between Gukesh and Magnus in the 2023 Zagreb SuperUnited Blitz Tournament. I hope I got that right. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button and check out this video right here, where I cover one of Gukesh D's greatest games against the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen. If you haven't seen this game, it is a shocker. Check it out, and I'll see you in the next video.